like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like a dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time anyway.
All right, Tom Woods, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Doing well. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really glad to be speaking to you in the flesh, so to speak. I was a relative latecomer to your show. I found you, like many people did, during COVID. And I have a very definite memory of you talking to RFK, and roughly around the same time that Biden was kind of contemplating blocking everyone without a certain medical procedure access to any job ever. And I was in college at the time with my buddies sitting around like, are we gypsies now? Right? Is this just what we are? You know, completely unemployable. Turns out I made myself unemployable, but that's a story for another day. So yeah, really enjoyed your stuff, especially through COVID. And yeah, I'm glad to have you on the show.
Thank you. I thought you were going to mention in that interview I did with RFK Jr. back in, maybe it was 2021, he had just released his book, The Real Anthony Fauci. And I wanted to ask him something that he hasn't been asked 100,000 times before. So I said, do you consider Anthony Fauci to be a sinister person? You know, so in other words, not just a good guy gone wrong, or he's trying his best, but the things he does have the opposite of the intended outcome or anything like that. Do you think he's a sinister person? And he started his answer off by saying, well, you know, I don't like to call names and whatever. But then he talked himself into it. So at the end of the answer it was, so yes, I do consider him a sinister person. And I thought, success. You know, that is an interviewer's success. He doesn't want to say it at the beginning of his answer. By the end, he's with me.
Yeah, you almost wonder if that was anywhere in those Senate confirmation hearings, right? The clip from your show, which if we're talking about kind of badges of success as an interviewer, it is, you know, gets featured in the official, like, you know, Senate transcripts, right?
Someday, I still have that aspiration. Someday, somebody will dig up, wait a minute, this guy was on this crazy extremist show? That can't be. We can't allow this guy in the government.
And look, I get it. You know, I wouldn't consider myself particularly tasteful or mainstream, but sinister is a relatively minor insult in the grand scheme of things, right? For a guy who was doing what he did with remdesivir and, you know, puppies, right? Sinister is probably an apt term.
Yeah, it's about the least you can say about it. But still, the thing is, we have to remember that in 2020, people like Jay Bhattacharya, who became, you know, obviously he's the NIH director now, and became harsh critics of Anthony Fauci, at the beginning were very reserved and said, well, Anthony Fauci's a recognized expert. And, you know, I have his textbook right here on the shelf, and I just have a difference of opinion with him on such and such. And that was the same thing with Martin Kulldorff at Harvard. And then as time went on, they both got much spicier. Like, no, this is not just a matter of we have an honorable disagreement. I mean, there's something seriously psychotically wrong with this. So that's why it actually was a big deal to get him to say sinister, because everybody was super deferential at the beginning, and his favorability rating was like 90, it was north of 90% at the beginning. And eventually we reached a point at which the unfavorables slightly outpolled the favorables on how do you feel about Anthony Fauci? So I considered that a victory, given that he started off at that crazy level.
Yeah, it was sort of an interesting thing to sort of paraphrase the president, right? I sort of consider COVID to be my personal Vietnam. But in all seriousness, right, it was an incredibly traumatic event, especially for people who were in that, you know, high school to college age when it happened. And I'll never forget that feeling of, you know, living and working in a progressive city and feeling like, you know, you had a target on your back, right? That if anyone found out that you were one of the bad people, you were one of the outsiders, then you would be, you know, effectively, you know, kicked out of polite society. And I think that that's a large part of the reason that I guess you could say just the broader dissident movement, right? People unsatisfied with the regime, either from a health perspective, a political perspective, or a religious one. It seems as if that group of people multiplied rapidly over COVID. It was sort of a catalyst or a supercharger to that kind of breaking off from, you could call it the post-war consensus, or, the empire, whatever term you want to use.
This moment really was a turning point for a lot of people in numerous different ways. Even for me, I mean, here I am, a guy who I ended up writing a book on the subject, and yet even for me, it was a moment. First of all, because I never thought they would go to these lengths. I just thought, well, maybe this thing's going to be pretty bad, but what can you do? I had no idea that they would go to these lengths. But then also, it made me realize that I can't take, I know this is going to sound so obvious to a lot of people. I'm sorry I was slow to reach this conclusion, that I can't take the medical establishment at face value, which honestly, I more or less thought I could up to that point. And it's ridiculous for me to say. But my friend Kevin Dolan, who is a really, really insightful guy, he runs the natal conference every year about the problem of population decline. And Kevin, at one of my events, I beg your pardon, do you know him?
Not only that, literally the last recording I was in yesterday was with Kevin Dolan.
Oh, okay, so I don't need to tell you.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. All right.
I just thought that was a weird detail to bring up. Like, literally, the last person I spoke to on the internet was Kevin Dolan.
Oh, that is fun. Well, I absolutely love Kevin, and he is a co-owner of a company that I have, and so I know him quite well. And he just has this tendency. He's one of these people who he can just drop a profundity, like it's nothing. And he did that at a small get together I had, and he said, "The future is people you can trust." And I thought, well, you could first of all, you could write a whole book on that. You could give a speech on that easily. The future is people you can trust. And that is, I mean, we live in a world where you can't trust your kid's teacher. You can't trust the news. You can't trust the doctor down the street. You can't, I mean, it really is true that the future is people you can trust. So Kevin and I together have something called the Tom Woods School of Life. And the point of it is we have in there people who do know stuff about medicine, people who do know how to inoculate your kids against gender theory, people who have reliable information, because the future is people you can trust. Well, so for me, COVID was an eye-opener, because I realized, geez, there are even fewer people that I can trust than I thought before. And then I think it opened eyes of a lot of people who probably would have been inclined to go along with something that, let's say, the Democrats urged them to do. But this was just a bridge too far for some people. And that opened their minds to other things. Well, if they're lying to me about this, like there was a doctor, I don't know what his political instincts were, left or right, in the past, but there was a doctor who's become quite well known during COVID, Pierre Corey. I had him on the Tom Woods Show. And he said, what was interesting about COVID is that I've been reading the New York Times for a long time, so I think maybe we do know what his political inclinations had been. I've been reading the New York Times for a long time. And then when I saw what they were writing about this topic, which is something I know a lot about, I realized they are, at best, misleading people. And he said what it made me realize was, if they're misleading people in an area that I know a lot about so I can spot it, what about all those other areas where I'm not an expert? Have they been pulling the wool over my eyes? So that's what I mean. Like, this was really a watershed moment for people who were even half awake. It was a chance to force those eyelids up a little bit farther.
Yes. Yeah, so there are several things there, right? Whatever this society regime you want to call it that we consider ourselves in opposition to is really the house that FDR built, right? That's sort of the mold in which, the current version of America was made. And FDR, obviously this process has existed all throughout modernity, but he did a very good job of replacing what had been natural structures sort of governed by trust. So for instance, there's no contract that you would have signed 150 years ago that said, well, you have to take care of your parents when they're old, right? There was no official legal document that said that, but that was simply a social expectation. That's what people did. There was a social unspoken bond. And what FDR did is the same thing that a certain strain of the liberal movement has done, for 400 years, was to break a social bond and insert a legal, explicit sort of, I guess, bureaucracy in its place, right? Taking something out of the social framework and putting it into a legal one. And so what does that do? Well, one, it provides you an immense amount of power. All of a sudden there's, a whole number of positions you can put your sinecures into. There's a massive, bureaucracy that goes on into, enforcing such a thing. But also you create dependent people. So, Social Security is a great example. No longer are people dependent on their own families. Do they have, as we've seen, no longer do they have an incentive to pass on wealth and to make sure that their children do well, just out of the rational self-interest of they will be taking care of me. But also you turn that population into a dependent one, right? Old people are, broadly speaking, one of the biggest voter blocs, certainly in the US, even more so in the UK and across Europe. And I think that when we look at all of these complex bureaucratic systems breaking apart, right, the rule of experts, where it is no longer what do people I trust think, but what does this guy in a lab coat, ascended sort of from the ivory tower, tell me to do, right? The official kind of, I guess, ruling of the priestly caste. Well, I think the antidote is to return to a previous way that humans organize themselves, which is based off of trust, based off of loyalty, one might say. And I think that's sort of an interesting thing. And look, I've only voted once, and I voted for Trump once. I'm not a MAGA guy. I'm not really like a Republican particularly, or even a conservative. But when I look at Trump, I see something interesting, which is a return to loyalty to a man instead of loyalty to an institution per se. Which, like, if you talk to people who love Trump, like, they love Trump. They don't necessarily love the Republicans or love, certain things about, Washington. And I think that in a weird way, that's sort of a return to a older, more honest form of politics, which is I like you personally because you do something for me. Am I overextending that idea there, Tom?
Well, it so happens I have a friend named Marco Bassani. He used to be a professor at the University of Milan. And whenever he hears that famous expression, the rule of law, not the rule of men, he always says, well, I would rather be ruled by good men than bad laws. And I always kind of went for that because I always felt like the rule of law was kind of a trick, in that it was the kind of thing that classical liberals would say. But then in practice, I think sometimes they idealize the legal system. We have the rule of law. If most Americans had any inkling of how the, quote, rule of law really operates in this country, they would be shocked. But all the same, I'm a little bit sympathetic to Hans Hoppe's analysis of monarchy in this area, because his point on that was one thing that constrains the monarch is that he's got to pass the realm on to his heir. He doesn't want to pass on something that's saddled with debt, that's unpayable, and a society that's torn against itself, and to get himself involved in ideological wars that grind up a huge portion of the population. He has no interest in any of this. He has an interest in maintaining the capital value, the long-term value of the realm, which means he has a longer time horizon than a good man who's in office for 4 years would have. Now, I know that as Americans, we're not allowed to think this way. That is very unpatriotic to do that kind of analysis. But I think at this point, as we've observed the degradation of Western society, I think we are allowed once again to pose the occasional thought experiment, or to indulge certain intellectual puzzles, let's say.
Yeah, so several things there. I think that Hoppe's point is largely accurate because, again, look, I think neither of us are naive about human nature. Even in the best run society, people do bad things. And so the question is, well, okay, assuming human nature is inherently flawed, Augustine is correct in that man is flawed, body, soul, and spirit. Well, what is to be done? Even our leaders are clearly men. We would hope for them to be better men than us, but nonetheless, they are flawed. Well, the idea is, to align their incentives with ours, to make sure that, acting in their own best interest, it will benefit us. And so Hoppe's point of saying, well, let's assign ownership of the country to one man and his family. We avoid the tragedy of the commons. And Land has this great line where he talks about the thrifty politician. Where he says the thrifty politician is an evolutionary dead end, right? He's someone who's not taking advantage of everything as he should. And I think that that's really a problem with government as it is, especially in a society without a moral consensus. Because if you have a moral consensus, if everyone's on the same page, then you can, at least to a limited degree, prescribe certain behaviors. But you see this in warfare, for instance, where certain cultures decide, hey, look, we don't want to let things get out of hand. So we'll develop a code, and all conflict will be, at least, nominally, within the box. You can do a similar thing to politics, but there are two problems. One, it requires that moral unity. And two, once it's broken, it's broken. It's completely dead and gone. And simply wishing or acting as if those sort of Robert's rules are still in place, well, that doesn't bring that into effect. You are just handicapping yourself while your opponent violates the rules of the game. And if you're in the prisoner's dilemma, where it requires restraint and honorable action by all parties, and well, you've been in jail with this guy before, and it's the 10th or 11th time he's dobbed you into the cops, understandably, that is how you lose that consensus. That's how you lose the limit, which would have let a liberal democratic system such as ours function in such a way that it wasn't just a simple smash and grab. And I say this like it's just happened. This happened a very, very long time ago, right? That the system sort of became a smash and grab. And I guess to sort of pick your brain on this, it is my firm belief that, our current system really is still made in the mold of FDR. And if we assume that, I think it's reasonable to say that the opposition to that system at least has some sort of through line, some sort of intellectual heritage. And you've done a lot of great work, and I've read a lot of books you've recommended about the so-called old right, the people who reacted to the changes FDR made to America. So if you could you briefly describe the right-wing response to FDR, and then maybe if you could connect that to something maybe more immediately relevant to my listeners?
I was just talking about this with my wife the other day because she was asking me about the difference between the right in certain periods of time in the 20th century and today. And for instance, she was curious about, she said, well, I assume they were all, conventionally religious, for example. And I said, some of them were, no doubt. Bill Buckley said he was a Catholic, and Russell Kirk, is a little tricky to figure out, but I think he was more or less conventionally religious. But like people like the early people, like Albert J. Nock, I'm not so sure. Like H.L. Mencken, whom I would generally include in there. Garrett Garrett, who I know it could be pronounced Garrett Garrett, but I just love that his name is Garrett Garrett, so that's how I say it. I don't know what his religion was. He wrote for the Saturday Evening Post. He wrote, I think, the best work against FDR was the work of Garrett Garrett.
Was it People's Pottage or? Yeah,
People's Pottage, which is it's a book that's got 3 of his essays in it. And it's The Revolution Was, Ex-America, and I think The Rise of Empire. And it's tremendously well done. He has a very Ernest Hemingway style of writing, even though he's a nonfiction writer. And I like him very much. So in second place, we have John T. Flynn, who wrote the book The Roosevelt Myth, which is a takedown of FDR, although it's a takedown from FDR from the point of view of a Hooverite, which is kind of odd. I mean, Hoover also had problems, but that book hit number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list. That was a big deal. But yet, I personally have no idea what John T. Flynn's religious views were, and I have no idea what Garrett Garrett's religious views were. So they may have been conventionally religious, but that was not front and center. And I think it was in the 1980s that became politically important, that we had the rise of the Christian Coalition and stuff like that. But the reason I raise this is that I think, because I was trying to answer that question, why does that not stand out a little bit more? Like Leonard Read, who started the Foundation for Economic Education. I don't know what and that could just be my ignorance, or I knew it and I forgot it. But if it really defined him in a way that it was all over his material, I've forgotten about it. And I think part of that was there were certain things people just took for granted together as a society. Like there were certain norms, moral norms and cultural norms people just took for granted. So there's no real need to go around trumpeting that I'm a Christian and we have to maintain Christian values. Why would you need to say that if in the public square, like in the public square, for all you want to criticize, let's say the 1950s, in the public square, if a Charlie Kirk had been killed, no one would have been such an oaf and a savage as to celebrate that publicly. Absolutely nobody. Like, that would not have happened. This was a time when even there's a left liberal guy named Bennett Cerf. Bennett Cerf was editor at Random House, one of the biggest publishers in America. He published Ayn Rand, interestingly. Even though he was a left liberal, he described Rand as having a, quote, cockamamie philosophy, but he just thought she was fascinating. Like he said to her, look, the 40-page John Galt speech in Atlas Shrugged has to go. He says, it's just repeating themes you've said all through the book. We have to edit this thing. Her response was, would you edit the Bible? So he realized this is going to be hopeless. But anyway, he's a fascinating guy. If you watch Bennett Cerf on the old TV show in the 1950s, What's My Line? He comes out immaculately dressed. He's charming. He is debonair. He's funny. He's witty. He's articulate. He's knowledgeable. He is courteous toward others. He is respectful of other people's views. That was a left liberal in the 1950s. And yes, I know that it's considered silly for conservatives to be nostalgic for that. The left will tell me that that's silly, and the right, the hard right, will say, well, we already had problems in the 50s. It goes back. I get it. But I could raise my kids in the 50s because I could live next door to Bennett Cerf. I could live next door to Bennett Cerf because he doesn't think men can be women. And now I get that there's something about left liberalism that propels it on a trajectory where it's constantly undermining what the previous generation believed, and eventually he will get to believing that men can be women, but not in 1958 he didn't. And so I think about that when that's the left liberal establishment, when the worst thing going on in America is Adlai Stevenson, I don't think there was any perceived need for people to wear their religious faith on their sleeve. They just lived it or believed it, or they didn't. But in terms of your question specifically about FDR, the people to read, yes, I would find The People's Pottage by Garrett Garrett, because that looks at both the domestic and the international side of FDR. The domestic side he does extremely well. Now, John T. Flynn, there was later published, sorry I'm forgetting the details here, but I am reasonably certain that he released, no, I beg your pardon. I think it was Herbert Hoover. Now I'm getting a little mixed up because I haven't looked at this material in so long. But I think it might have been Hoover who later on released a critique of the FDR foreign policy, which is very significant because that's supposed to be the good part of it. But if you look at the, quote, old right, their view was that, well, I think we all know what their view was, that World War I was a disaster. The European powers should just fight themselves to exhaustion. And really it was the Russians who ended up defeating the Nazis anyway. Overwhelmingly, it was the Russians who did it. So it is a little irritating to hear Americans cheering about, where would the world be if we hadn't been around? Well, the Russians and their 27 million dead might have a word to say about that. But that is, in fact, what wound up happening. But they didn't like where things were going, that FDR was clearly dishonest with the public. And I'm not even touching on Pearl Harbor, which there's still some reasonable doubt about. But on matters of leading up to 1941 or throughout 1941, American ships would be dropping depth charges on German ships, and then when the Germans would retaliate, FDR would say, "Oh my goodness, look at the Germans! They look at their firing on us." I mean, they didn't go for that. Like, this is not going to end up in a good in a good place. And they, they didn't like military conscription. Even Russell Kirk called military conscription slavery. Now today, some of the dumb, like the low IQ right wing would call him a pinko commie for that. But a conservative would say, there are loyalties a man has above the state, and the state cannot dispose of his life in the service of its imperial ambitions, because you never know where those are going to take us. But so I would recommend that. I mean, you can read secondary sources about what people were saying about FDR, but these are primary sources that you will get tremendous enjoyment out of. So I recommend The Roosevelt Myth by John T. Flynn and The People's Pottage by Garrett Garrett, and you're just going to be very, very impressed, and then subsequently very unimpressed by like right-wing radio hosts in the here and now.
Yeah, there are several things there, and I'm sure you've had the same experience. I love telling people relatively easily verifiable facts about FDR that nobody believes. Like, hey, did you know FDR made owning gold illegal? And the response you get is like, are you crazy? Like, that sounds like the most absurd tinfoil hat conspiracy theory. You're like, oh no, he did. And just arbitrarily set the price of gold by picking numbers out of thin air, right? It really was, it's sort of an American dictator. And the reason that I wanted to focus on that is because, and I can't remember where I took this from. I read it somewhere in a book. How's that for a citation, right? That pre FDR, America didn't really have a conservative movement. There were different, obviously, schools of thought, but they were ultimately progressive. So if you look at Hamilton and Jefferson, which is the classical divide, Jefferson, which is the school sort of more associated with the right and conservatism, is still on the grand scheme progressive. Right? Obviously, he made his own Bible. He was a big fan of Lockean liberalism. So it is not conservatism in the same way that there's an English conservative tradition at the same time. And the point of this article, which I realize not being able to cite really undercuts my point here, is that the conservative movement in America is based in the initial reaction to FDR. And from that point, you mentioned that at least in the initial sort of skirmishes, right, the first generation between, FDR, his, coterie and the old right, that there wasn't as much of an explicit religious focus. I think that you're entirely correct there. And you mentioned the sort of entropic nature of the left, where you give them an inch, it becomes a mile, and it's sort of this, like, I guess you would say, like, parabolic curve, right? Things get crazier and crazier and crazier one after the other. Because I think the injection of religion, obviously it comes in the 80s. Well, what is the 1980s Christian conservative coalition, right? Well, to be honest, it's pretty close to Nixon's coalition, right? It's sort of the silent majority with the moral majority, which is stupid to say those back to back, kind of bolted one to another. And so it seems as if, right, the conservative movement is continually reacting to the excesses of the left. And the kind of first generation progressive American FDR left was much more worried with social or with economic functions, right? Building up a managerial state, as Burnham would say it. And their children decided to, burn their bras and, embark on the summer of love. And, a few years later, that produced sort of a right-wing backlash. I realize I'm dramatically oversimplifying, but do you think I'm getting at something there, Tom?
I do. Before I say anything, I want to clarify what I said. I just checked. It was that Hoover did write a full-blown history of the Second World War and its aftermath, but it was not released. It was only 50 years later that George H. Nash, who was a great historian of the conservative movement, actually put it together, edited it, and published it. So it's called Freedom Betrayed. So it's Hoover's own analysis of FDR. Has not been widely read, but it's a very, very valuable historical document, and I wanted to, because I it was just in the back of my, I knew it had been released. Like I myself haven't read it, but I definitely should. Now I beg your pardon, I've completely forgotten what you were asking me. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. Sorry. I guess I was just commenting on the sort of reactive nature of conservative politics in the US, where sort of the first generation of that conflict is fought on the terms dictated by FDR. The second generation is fought based on the terms dictated by, I guess you could say, maybe the hippie movement and the New Left, right? Whoever that second generation of progressives is.
Yeah, so I think that's what makes the present moment a little bit different, and this is why the left is off balance. Because some of the conservative arguments now, or I hate conservative, you know what I mean, like right of center, right wing arguments, are not a case of the left has set the terms of debate and the right is simply conforming, and like we all have to be within the range. We all have to express the platitudes of the civil rights movement or whatever it is, because that's the respectable range of opinion. Now that's just being blasted out of the water. Now you have people questioning everything, and you even have J.D. Vance hinting that maybe America's not just an idea. Maybe there's more to America. Maybe there is, heaven forbid, there is a heritage here, and that it's more than just because the people who give us the whole America's just an idea thing, you say, all right, well then, what about the Naturalization Act of 1790, which certainly did not sound like it was just an idea that anybody could come join? Or what about Federalist Number 2, which said, the great thing about America is how similar we all are despite our differences. We're all the same this, the same that, the same. And the answer I get is, well, they didn't perfectly instantiate. So wait a minute, what? Like, you're telling me people who were contemporaries of the Declaration of Independence didn't understand it as well as some guy on Twitter in 2025? So I think what's happened now is that there are conservatives, or again, right-wingers, who have decided, we're just throwing the whole table over here. I'm not going to debate this on the, I'm not going to say, the real racists are the Democrats. I'm going to say, you accuse me of racism, I'm going to laugh in your face. I'm not having this argument anymore. You never even define what the term means. Nobody is ever accusing you of that in good faith, so I'm not playing along anymore. Now, that's different. We're not arguing on your terms. Or when it comes to immigration, issues like that, I don't feel like I even have to defend myself or explain myself. I think people, like we saw demonstrations in Australia, in Great Britain, of people in effect saying, I don't even need to explain myself or justify myself to you that I want a home. I want a home like everyone else on this planet wants a home. And since we all know that there is nothing dishonorable about that, because all the world wants it, I don't feel like I have to argue on your terms and say, well, real diversity would be, I don't care what fake diversity, real diversity, I don't use your language. I'm not going to be judged by you. I'm not going to let a jury of people like you render judgment on me. I don't speak that way. Like, that's what we're starting to see. That's very different from how we used to see these arguments take place. And that's what has the left off balance, because they're used to controlling the way the debate runs. The New York Times will tell you that the range of debate runs from Bill Clinton to Bob Dole. And that's the way they like it. Boring and inconsequential.
Yeah, I feel like you're entirely correct there. And obviously there were rumblings about this before. There were things said by Trump and by others indicating that the left was no longer a universally agreed upon moral arbiter. But for me, the case I think marks a turning point here is the sort of crudely named Big Balls saga. For those who don't remember, one of the kids working at Doge had an edgy Twitter alt under the pseudonym Big Balls. And on that, he was saying edgy things. The things that guys who are 20, when given unrestricted internet access and a bunch of their friends will say. Things that maybe I wouldn't or you wouldn't, Tom, but, edgy jokes. And when this got revealed by a journalist, he was dropped from his position at Doge. And JD Vance catches wind of this and says, no, this is not what we do. We don't let you cancel our guys. He's apologized. He gets his job back. Basically, you don't get to dictate to us who we hang out with, that you aren't the person who limits our rights of association. And I thought that was an interesting moment because cancel culture has been used as a scourge from the left to the right for generations. I mean, all the paleocons that I love, all the great guys that, like Derbyshire, Francis, any one of these guys who got pushed out of the conservative movement by people technically on the conservative movement, using the standards of their enemies. What Vance said, or seemed to say there, was basically, no, we don't do that anymore. And look, I'm not the biggest fan of Vance. There are things that he does that I don't approve of, but I thought that was an interesting switch in mentality, a switch from being sort of morally, I guess, sort of outsourcing your enforcement to your enemies. Because ultimately, as we've seen, if your enemies, if the people who have a alternate, mutually incompatible view of America, of human nature, of religion, whatever, if they determine what is ultimately right or wrong, you are just negotiating how quickly they get to win. And to your point again about COVID and, the gender stuff, I think, or let alone what, happened to Charlie Kirk or this, poor Irina refugee from, Ukraine, is I think people realize the consequences of losing, quote unquote, politics. That this wasn't simply, oh, now my taxes are marginally higher than I'd like, or, the sort of meaningless issues of another era. And I realize they aren't meaningless just in comparison. It will be too dangerous for you to exist in your city after a certain hour, or you can be shot for being right of center, or we will just lock you in your house for as long as we want. And I think that as well hints to that sort of degradation that, even the left can no longer control themselves. They can't make the long-term better play by, getting what they want over a longer period of time by, as Bill Clinton did, recognizing that you need to control crime, or realizing that you probably can't just say, yes, I want to shoot all of my political opponents, even if that's really what you think, because it makes it hard to win elections after that. Sorry, Tom, that was a massive rant, but I'll throw it back to you.
Well, the other side of what you're saying about in this day and age, the consequences of federal politics are such that if they turn out a certain way, your life is not just marginally affected. Like you are going to have the feeling that they're coming after people like you. As Jeff Deist says, that you are politically vanquished, and a politically vanquished people can expect to be run roughshod over, and that's not particularly pleasant. Now, I'm not trying to. Let me be honest. I am tooting my own horn here. A lot of times we hold conferences, and I have nothing against conferences where we teach people things. I believe in preaching to the choir. There's nothing wrong with preaching to the choir. The choir needs to be built up and educated and be articulate so that, like any real choir, sits and listens to the sermon. So this preaching to the choir nonsense is ridiculous. The choir sits and listens to the sermon like everybody else. And therefore, the choir is better prepared to go out into the world and convert people. So I have nothing against, quote unquote, preaching to the choir. We need that. But sometimes our conferences consist of we go to we pay an arm and a leg to go somewhere. A bunch of people bark at us about how bad the left is. We clap our hands, we go home, and nothing happens. And I've just decided now, every once in a while, we need a pep talk. We need a rah-rah series of speeches to build up, our energy levels and our determination. And that's fine too. But at some point, maybe we need to talk about things we can do, not who gave the most eloquent speech. We already know what the problems are and who the bad guys are. So what do we do? So every year I hold what I call an unconference, where and Kevin Dolan comes to it. And at the unconference, we do not have a series of lecturers who stand up there and bark things at you. Instead, I realized that the kind of people who come to my events are smart. They've got at least one area that they know a lot about. And now that could be something like Bitcoin, but it could also be something like estate planning. And it can also be something like how to build up FU money so you don't have to care about what these people say, or how to build a business apart from the man, where you can just live on your own terms, or or about parenting, or about all these things that we have to deal with. We're living in a hostile society. Even with Trump elected, that does not mean that the society is not hostile to you. How do you thrive in that? How do you not just survive, but thrive in that kind of society? I'm not going to get to the bottom of that by giving speeches about, remember Nancy Pelosi? She was pretty bad. That's not useful. I want people to show up at my events, learn something from everybody who speaks, because the participants are the speakers. I have 3 different rooms. Everybody signs up for a slot who wants to speak, and people decide which room to go into. And so I have 30 presentations going on all different things. And the point is, you're going to learn something really valuable that will make your life tangibly better immediately, and it's going to be taught to you by somebody who doesn't hate your guts. So I almost have called it the People Who Don't Hate You Summit. But instead I went with unconference. It's the unconference. And stuff like that. That's why I'm here now. It's because I don't want to just write angry letters to the editor. Enough is enough. We already get it. But it's time to actually sit up and do something. Do something. And so that's what I have the unconference. I have my School of Life program. I run 2 business masterminds so that successful people can become even more successful. So we can give even more evil people the middle finger. That is where my what I find exciting about what I do these days. That's where my passion is, because I don't want it to say on my tombstone, he recorded 7,000 podcast episodes. I mean, that's great. That's done a lot of good for a lot of people. I've changed a lot of minds. I get great testimonials. But I'd rather it be that I helped somebody get independent from the man. Do you know how many people in our movement got a corporate job in their 20s because they didn't know what else to do? And it is sucking the life out of them. It is sucking the life out of them. And people say today, and this is Kevin commented on this too. All people want is a reasonable chance at a middle class life, and a traditional 9-to-5 job, whatever. And Kevin says, when I had that traditional job and the chance at a middle class life, I was more miserable than I've ever been. And Kevin, with his exit group, and me with my School of Life, we do a billion things in this School of Life program, but one of them is, if your soul is being stomped on, we pull you out of that and we figure out something else for you. We'll build you something else, or you'll build something else. We'll show you how to do it. But we'll pull you out of that, because so many of our people are looking around at their lives and saying, can this really be it? Is this it? This is my life? Like that? You can't just give a lecture about how nasty Nancy Pelosi is when our own people are suffering like this. These are things we can fix. We don't need any legislation for it. We can fix if we get off the podium for 5 minutes and actually bother to do something productive.
Yeah, there's there
you go. Now I'm
there.
done.
This is what was really encouraging to me about the most recent Old Glory Club conference earlier this year. I went just before I revealed my face. And so that was a useful thing, because it meant as long as I shut up, I could basically walk wherever I want and just listen to people, which apparently is a weird thing to do, but it is a nice way to understand what's going on, right? And I was incredibly impressed by, and for those who aren't familiar, Old Glory Club is a fraternal organization with dozens of local chapters across the country that myself and other people helped start a few years ago. And I was incredibly impressed by the attitude there. Look, there were speeches there. There were great speeches there. there was a lot of, pounding the podium.
Yeah, and I'm not opposed to great speeches. I'm not. We're flesh and blood human beings. We need inspiration.
100%. But the thing that stuck with me, the thing that I thought that, produced a, hey, maybe we're going to get out of this sort of reaction, it was two things. One, the incredible quality of human capital opposed to the regime, whatever you want to say the big evil thing is. Because it wasn't just the kind of stereotype you'll get on network television, right? Losers and cranks with tinfoil hats, on welfare. These are impressive people who could be doing something else than being here. People with professional jobs who own small businesses. For instance, right, the Shenandoah chapter of the Old Glory Club, I got to meet those guys. I just hadn't before. And, of the five founding, the officers, and I won't say any more details because obviously they probably don't want to be mentioned on the podcast, but, 3 out of 5 of them own very serious local businesses, guys who have, people working under them, guys who, to be honest, probably have something better to do than to take 5 days out of their schedule to meet up with a bunch of strangers from the internet at a hotel in the middle of nowhere. But why are they there? 2 reasons. 1, they see a problem, right? There's something that needs to be fixed. And 2, they think it's worth it. And look, we've spent a great deal of time talking about how you shouldn't outsource your moral opinions to other people. But generally speaking, if a lot of successful, highly compensated people think something is worth their valuable time, it's not a 1-to-1, but it's a decent correlation that there is something in building parallel institutions, in building organizations so that people can sort of unplug from the matrix. And again, listening to these people talking to them, and this is a very similar experience I had when I spent time with the exit group guys. It was this sort of realization of like, oh, we're going to win this thing. Not just because, the kind of, shall we say, the gravity of politics, that ultimately these are, unsustainable and stupid arrangements over time. But also, you have this hyper concentration of capable, competent people who feel as if they have been sort of aggrieved, that there isn't a way for them to get what they want out of life. And so they've said, well, you know what? I'm going to do something difficult and dangerous to build that. And look, I mean, throughout the history of the West, we've seen these sort of associations, whether it's any 3 of the organizations we've mentioned, do incredible things. And what I notice, and you see this same dynamic with technology, that there's sort of a tipping point. And depending on what it is and who you're asking, it's between 7 and 14% of early adopters. You probably remember, Tom, the first guy you saw with a Palm Pilot, the first guy you saw with an iPhone, where it sort of hits, these early adopters and then very quickly scales to everyone. And obviously, I'm not saying that, whatever these sort of institutions we're talking about, these ideas are instantly going to scale to mass adoption. But I do think there is something exciting about being in at the ground floor, if you see what I'm saying, in an organization of capable, competent people interested in building, right? Interested in doing more than just kind of, complaining to your, assembled audience of 100 friends about, why the left is mean, bad, and scary.
Well, I was invited to the Old Glory Club meeting, and I'm only available every other week. It's just because of the way my schedule works, and it was an off week. But it certainly sounded like a good group, and this kind of thing does make me happy. That I think a lot of us who are like, let's say, broadly in our camp, have just grown tired, because I think the conference, the events with the huge audiences and everything have long been a staple of Conservatism Inc. We give the outward impression that things are happening because, look, we have this big crowd at our conference. But in fact, in reality, not much is going on. And I think maybe we're seeing that change.
Yeah, and I think that is speaking of, when we talk about sort of pulling back moral legitimacy, one of the things that the regime is the most scared of is of effectively generally right-wing organizations of any stripe, right? That is the thing that must be gone after. And obviously, if you're doing something dangerous or illegal, they're particularly focused on you. And to be honest, you're probably you're probably sort of making things difficult for yourself anyway. But to me, I always think that that's an interesting admission, right? That is what they come down on hardest of all. For instance, there's an organization in the UK broadly similar to the ones that we've described. And they used Hope Not Hate, sort of one of their shady, totally non-governmental organizations, right? You're familiar with the type that are in no way connected to the government, but receive all of their funding from the government, right? They spent 3 years infiltrating that organization, put together a massive expose to try and blow them up because they saw that as being a threat to their authority. And look, not a threat in the sense of like 1776 will commence again, but that mechanism earlier of taking loyalty, taking, social, spiritual, cultural bonds and bringing them into the sort of the legislative realm, bringing them into the state, formalizing them. Well, if people resist that, if they bring them back into the realm of loyalty, well, there goes their power, right? It's no surprise that they're terrified of, these kind of bonds of loyalty, if you see what I'm saying.
I couldn't help thinking about just now something that maybe if my answer earlier hadn't been already so long that I might have added about, because I want to make sure I cover enough material about what, the right wing used to be like. So I would, if you don't mind, I would like to make quick mention of something that came up recently, actually on Twitter, because of a guy who's with the Babylon Bee. And the Babylon Bee, up to a point, does some good stuff from time to time. Like we all laugh at the headlines, because very often they're quite spot on. But they've got people there who, aren't very friendly to the hard right. And so one of them was saying, oh my gosh, all these crazy hard right people, they even question the idea of equality, which is embedded in the American ideal and all this because, all men are created equal and all that. So, and they said, but they don't dare talk about it, that they are, anti-American in this way. So I said, well, not only do we dare talk about it, but the biggest debate in post-war conservatism, in terms of a memorable debate between two individuals, was Harry Jaffa versus M.E. Bradford in the pages of Modern Age about equality as a conservative principle. Bradford said equality is the antonym of every conservative principle. Jaffa said the opposite. And they hashed this out. They didn't say, well, Bradford's an extremist and he should be. But when Ronald Reagan tried to appoint M.E. Bradford as head of the National Endowment for the Humanities, all the neocons came together and said, you can't have that because he doesn't like Lincoln or some ridiculous thing. That's pretty typical. But interestingly, Reagan wanted to appoint this guy. So now we've gotten to a point where we can't even like the ideas of a guy Reagan appointed. Now, Reagan, to a normie is like a real extreme right-winger. To us, we know that wasn't the case. So, I can't even support Reagan's NEH appointee? Come on. Or nominee anyway. So, but what was particularly interesting about that debate, I might add, is that Harry Jaffa is associated with the Claremont Institute. Now, the Claremont Institute, over the past few years, has gotten much better than it used to be. I find that I agree with a lot of it. I remember the old days where they were giving their statesmanship award to Donald Rumsfeld, nonsense like this. I don't think that's going on anymore, so that's a good thing. So Jaffa was associated with them, and he was arguing that equality, is the central thing about America. And what Bradford was saying was equality is one of these ideas that keeps cutting out the ground from underneath itself. So that equality to you might think equality has this very limited meaning. But there's no way to stop somebody else who thinks it means something else from using it as a bulldozer to destroy your society and to get into every nook and cranny of your society to say, well, I think I've found some inequality here, and it'll never go away because there are always forms of inequality you can find, and that's just the way the regime likes it because they'll never run out of pretexts for things to do. What's interesting about that is Jaffa was a big opponent of so-called gay rights, the vast majority of which are not rights. They're privileges. They're special privileges from the government, but that's neither here nor there. So he did not believe in, quote unquote, equality in the modern sense when it comes to LGBTQ. But yet, and yet what happened to Harry Jaffa? Well, the steamroller of equality that he believed in meant that his stuff about LGBT, all that, started to be removed even from the Claremont Institute's own website. Even they themselves thought this was too embarrassing because it's too anti-equality. It made Emmy Bradford's point that you can't stop this thing. It's a steamroller. And it steamrolled right over Harry Jaffa himself.
That reminds me of probably one of his most bombastic comments. I have sort of mixed feelings on Jerry Falwell Sr., but if you remember his infamous quote, "The homosexual steamroller will literally run over every man, woman, and child in America." Obviously, he was mocked for that for decades afterwards. But I almost wonder if he was echoing that phraseology, right?
Well, I basically came up with the steamroller thing, so I'm not attributing it to anybody. But I actually had not heard that. I don't know why. I guess it's pretty well known. I hadn't heard that.
Oh no, it's one of the infamous sort of canards trotted out towards anyone conservative or Christian. It was much more prominent when he was alive, right? But it was sort of one of the, like, I don't know how you'd describe it. It was in the, like, it was very popular in the new atheist era as a way to make fun of Christians who had anything, negative to say about gay marriage. Not relevant in the slightest to the discussion. It just is kind of a personal favorite quote of mine because slightly exaggeration. The man was right.
Yeah. I mean, it's obvious. And it's obvious in the fact that movement itself cheers for all its victories. Well, these victories have been extremely sweeping and have made radical changes all throughout society. What is that if not a steamroller? Maybe you don't like the word, but the reality is the same.
No, certainly. And obviously, the debate over equality, I mean, to be honest, is really at the root of the entire left-wing, right-wing debate, which is, are we interested in equality or justice? Does everyone get the same thing, or does everyone get what they deserve, right? Aristotle's conception of justice. And obviously there are gradations along that spectrum. But even from the perspective of, and I'm not an economist, I know absolutely nothing about the economy, but you see the exact same distinction made between, libertarians and, more left-wing economists, which is basically, should people be given bailouts, welfare? Should they be pushed towards equity? Or do people, companies, economic units get what they deserve, get the consequences of their own actions, get justice? And look, obviously there is a certain type of equality that, we as Christians of at least some variety would ascribe to, right? The idea that every, human being has a soul. But the cynical way in which that language is used to justify, let's be honest, communism of one form or another is, I think, something that I'm very glad to see Christians waking up to. Glad to see religious people of any stripe realizing that is a cynical line used to sort of jam the narrow end of the wedge in. And quickly that becomes not simply the kind of, we could say like salvific equality, right? The broadest possible sense to, slowly, sort of pushing the knife in. Maybe a discussion for another day. But Tom, we are fast approaching time. If people want to find more of your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, I'm gonna commit well, you know what? No, I'll just give one link. What I'm about to do is considered to be a no-no in marketing circles. You are supposed to link people. Now, most people will say, "Oh, my podcast is this," or "Follow me on social media." I don't say that. I don't send people to my website because my website has a million things and people get distracted. I want to send them to a place where there's only one thing they can do, and that is follow me by getting on my mailing list. And my mailing list is good. You say, I don't want to be on a mailing list. Yes, you do. You've been misled. The one you want to be on is mine. People get on it and they stay on forever. Like, unless you have brain damage, you're going to stay on it forever because I send you good stuff. It's going to be just like this conversation. However, the link I'm giving, this is taking a long time, isn't it? The link I'm giving has a lot of different choices on it, and marketers would say you shouldn't do that. You give people one choice, otherwise they get overwhelmed. I have more confidence in the human race than that. I feel like when people go to Barnes & Noble, they don't say, oh my gosh, so many choices, I can't buy anything, and they leave. No, they make a choice. So I have a site called tomsfreebooks.com because I've released a series of books on all kinds of controversial topics. You name it, I've got a free book on it. They're ebooks, but they're free. And people started saying to me, do you have a place where they're all stored so like I could get like 3 or 4 of them at once? So I finally did it. It's tomsfreebooks.com. So you go to tomsfreebooks.com, there's at least a dozen there, and you can get them all if you want. You know, my slogan on that site is never pay for a book again, because I will give you a lot of good reading material on that site. So tomsfreebooks.com, they're all gems. I'm very proud of all of them. And it's everything from Ukraine to gender theory to guns to the collateral damage of COVID to no, capitalism did not cause the 2008 financial crisis to here's what's wrong with the Fed, and no, it's not right to say, but in the 19th century we had all these downturns, so we needed the Fed to... All that is out. All that is smashed. I have an ebook on professors who, when they got the mob after them, didn't cave. Can you imagine that? There are professors who don't cave. There are like, a handful of them, but I like to highlight those people. So the link I'm giving is tomsfreebooks.com.
Well, that was incredibly professional. Now we're going to get to a much more amateurish shilling, which is my shilling. Jay Verdon Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you want to listen to podcasts. If you want the episodes early and ad-free, you're going to have to throw me a few bucks. You can do so on Patreon, Substack, Subscribestar, or Gumroad. If you want to support us more directly, head over to Axios Remote Fitness Coaching. JD, the owner, and I have launched a new program. Click that link. You get 2 free weeks, whatever you want. Custom. JD is incredibly good at what he does, so make sure to check that out. Again, Tom, I appreciate it, man. It was a ton of fun talking to you.
It was my pleasure, Jay. Thank you.
And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.